Sir, I commend this bill to the House.
David Clendon, a 5-minute call on behalf of the Green Party.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And on behalf of the Greens, I'm pleased to reiterate our support for this bill to go to Select Committee for a good investigation there, which I'm sure it will receive. The point's been made, and I won't labour it, that the legislation this will replace does date to 1966. That since that time our understanding of addiction is very different. There are many more substances, it would seem, to which one can become addicted. Our understanding of what constitutes appropriate treatment has changed, and as my colleague Kevin Haig mentioned, a shift away from a punitive regime to one genuinely focused on treatment is entirely appropriate, and I think those are all things that this legislation, this bill, seeks to achieve. Sadly, what hasn't changed, of course. It would seem there is still a need to have a statutory or a legislative power to compel people to take treatment if they are so in such a state of mind or that they're unable to make those decisions on their own behalf, as an option of last resort for people who either lack family or community support or indeed have rejected that in the depths of that addiction. And I should just say in passing, I have the greatest admiration for people at the sharp end of this sort of work who work with severely addicted people. I think you'd have to have a more than usual quality of compassion, because people in that very degraded state would not be the most attractive people to get up close and personal with, I believe. And it's a credit to those folk who do this work day in, day out, that they manage to pick people up out of that pit and help them onto a better path. So the Law Commission in 2010 issued a report on which this bill is based and established a number of key principles which we hope to see, and indeed there is evidence of them being embedded in the text of the Act. A very high threshold for compulsion, and that's as it should be. It is an extraordinary intervention in a person's life and against their rights, in a sense, to compel them to take treatment, and so the threshold needs to be high, and I think this bill does do that. The notion of limited duration, 8 weeks, seems to make a great deal more sense than 2 years, which does seem excessive. One would hope that after 2 years a person might be in much better shape to make their own decisions. The notion of protecting human rights, of course, and the idea that the compulsory treatment should lead directly onto a pathway, that people are not simply brought out of crisis and then abandoned, but that there will be an ongoing pathway for them to pursue a voluntary course of treatment for as long as that takes. In terms of protection of rights, it would seem the bill does make some efforts to address that. I like the fact that there are a clear definition of exactly what constitutes severe addiction, so that those people doing that assessment can make as sound a judgment as can be made. It defines clearly what treatment is and excludes certain things that on a bad day might be deemed treatment, but in fact would look more like punishment. There are criteria around which the compulsion may be determined to be the appropriate way to go. Proof of severe addiction, severely impaired judgment, that appropriate treatment is available, because of course it makes no sense to compel someone to a course of treatment if in fact there is nothing available to them. One would hope there always would be. So there are these fairly high bars set and a degree of principle underpinning that. We understand that, of course, the legislation does allow for some use of force if people are unwilling to be taken to a place of assessment or a place of treatment, and there are some safeguards around that. I'm particularly pleased to see that the treatment centres will be listed in the Crimes of Torture Act as places of detention, and therefore subject to the OPCAT, the Optional Protocol Convention Against Torture, and so the national preventative mechanisms, the Human Rights Commission, the Ombudsman and so on, will have oversight of these treatment centres, and I think that's an appropriate thing. It is an extraordinary, as I say, these will be some of the most vulnerable people in our community when they're in this condition, and of course it's appropriate that we have the highest order of monitoring of those sites where they will be treated. So, sir, I would simply finally say that if we seriously wish to reduce the number of people who will fall into this category of severely addicted, we need to look very hard at the current resourcing of community-based drug and alcohol treatment. I suspect that there's scarcely a provider in the country who has no waiting list, who is properly resourced. I'd encourage all of that to take that issue very seriously. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Ruth Dyson, a 5-minute call on behalf of the Labour